Hi guys, I'm Kristen. Welcome and welcome back. Today I'm going to be doing a full non-spoiler review for Age of Myth by Michael J. Sullivan. It's been a while since I've done a full review, so bear with me if the execution of this is a little bit rusty, but Age of Myth was the winner for my Pick My Next book for the month of June, and this is a series that I am doing this year every month, where you get to pick a book out of a selection of themed books. So this was a start of a new fantasy series, and overall, I absolutely loved this book. And I'm so grateful for all of you who voted for it. Let's start out with some logistics, and then we'll jump into various sections, as well as something that I always like to finish off with: who should read this book and who should not read this book. So this is the start of a fantasy series. It is a 6-book series. I've heard it kind of fits into that like 2 sets of trilogies where they are a complete story altogether, but there's a bit of a time jump, I believe, in between books 3 and 4. This series is called The Legends of the First Empire, and it is a completed series, so if you like this first book, you can just pick up the next one and read straight on through. It's also a prequel series for the Revelations, obviously by Michael J. Sullivan, and I believe it is set like 3,000 or 300, one of the two, years in the past before that series. I have not read the Revelations. It's something that I would like to read, but ultimately I decided that I wanted to start with this series first because the overall story, I think, sounded a little bit more interesting to me, and I have generally heard more rave reviews about this series overall as compared to the Revelations or Chronicles and that sort of storyline. So I decided to start with this one first. From what I hear, there is nothing particularly spoilery in starting with either or, but that there are tie-ins and Easter eggs. So if you read Revelations, for example, first, there are various legends and myths about what has happened in the past. And now we're actually going back and telling that story, but what we're seeing is that sometimes the myths and the legends aren't always exactly what happened, which is a setup that I thought was really, really cool. So I think if you're reading this one and you've already read Revelations, you're like, wait a second, that's not what's being said, however far in the future. So I just think that this overall, this is a really, really interesting, cool setup. It makes me that much more excited to read Revelations. I just am so interested, and I hope that I fall in love with this world, because then there are just a plethora of books to read in this setting. Let me know if you've read Revelations or this series and you have a strong opinion about which one you should read first. From what I heard, everyone said it doesn't really matter. You could do it either way and it'll be fine. Jumping into the specifics of this series and the setup and the storyline here and the characters involved, we have a classic, very classic feeling fantasy world. It is an ancient kind of a setting, so humans have very limited tools and technology, let's say that, no technology. And the human world is split up into various different clans. And this is also a traditional classical fantasy setting in the sense that within this world there are humans. There is a very long living, almost immortal, but they can die, but 3,000 years, lifespan kind of a thing, species that is very elven in rollout, called the Fray. It seems that there are also giants and goblins and perhaps dwarves as well. But because they are such long-living beings, the humans actually view these Fray as gods. And the instigating plot event here that gets the ball rolling in this book is that one of our human main characters, Wraith, finds himself, for reasons, on the opposite side, on the Fray side of this territorial line, and has cause to kill a Fray, or is in a situation where he is responsible for killing a Fray. And he ends up kind of going on the run along with one of the Fray's slaves, one of their human slaves, to try to escape sort of the consequences of having killed one of their gods. Now, because this was an event that they did not think that humans could kill Fray, the humans certainly didn't even know that the Fray could be killed. This is kind of a shockwave kind of moment or event in the lives of both the humans at this time as well as the Fray. And it is very clear that while this event has significant impact just in this book alone, like for the plot and where the plot goes in this book, you can tell that it is an event that is going to have wider, much more significant rippling effects. Despite this very seemingly classical world, the writing and the storytelling did not feel antiquated. It didn't feel particularly tropey or having been done before. It had a very approachable kind of writing and way of storytelling that feels like the reader is just being eased into this world. You can tell that there is so much more there, as I mentioned, with we're pretty sure there's dwarves. It mentioned a past war, and there seems to be, various different magic between the Frey and what the goblins perhaps have, and as well, we don't really know that much about the giants yet, but it wasn't an issue that you didn't know those details, because you were so focused in on just kind of getting a little bit of the setting at first, and it really feels like the world is just going to slowly expand out from there, along with political tension, changing political scene, and all of that as we progress throughout what is probably, or I think clearly, going to be a focus on uprising and war kind of a story. It also didn't have that classic bro fantasy kind of vibe, which some classic fantasy can feel. They can feel a little bit bro-y, whereas this one did not. In fact, the female characters, or the female POVs that we have, which was 3 of our main characters, I would say, were actually women, or one young girl, felt like, believable women. There was not really a stereotypical old-fashioned depiction of female characters, and I obviously really appreciate that. And I think that a lot of readers are going to appreciate that as well. Now, because I mentioned that it feels like the reader's kind of being eased into this world, I think this would make an extremely approachable place to start as a fantasy reader. If you are getting into the genre, if you are maybe perhaps coming up from more young adult or middle grade type books, it doesn't have that crossover feel at all that new adult feels like. It just feels like a very approachable fantasy book to get younger readers hooked into the genre. You can tell that there's going to be so much more in this world. Yes, this book has a little bit of a setup feel to it, and I will talk more about that in a moment, but it feels rich and full as it is, and you just know that there's going to be more. You're not being tossed into a world with very complex political dynamics and, thrown a whole bunch of new species and territorial disputes and whatever. There's some of that, but a very approachable amount. Now, that doesn't mean that only new readers to the genre can pick up this book and enjoy it. I do think it is very straightforward and approachable for the average fantasy reader. So it's not the most complex, dynamic story right out of the gate. But I can see that that's coming. I can see that there is more out there. I feel like I've said that a lot, but I can tell that there's more there. But it was done in a way that was just so easy to consume that you get hooked up in the story and don't have to sit and process crazy worlds and crazy relationships and dynamics as well. It just felt like a really enjoyable reading experience. So Wraith is obviously one of our main character POVs. We also have Persephone, who is another human, and she was the wife of one of the chieftains in one of the human settlements. There's a few different clans. We're dealing with this one in particular in this book. Wraith is from a different neighboring clan. Now, when we're first introduced to Persephone, her son has just recently died, and her husband dies as well. So she is suddenly in the place of having been the chieftain's wife and in a place of leadership for the past 20 years, and she is no longer in that role. However, she still feels a strong sense of responsibility for the health and safety of this community at large. And so Persephone's storyline is definitely grappling with this sense of still responsibility and leadership and the experience of 20 years of leadership and having to not actually be in a place of power within this particular setting. Then we have Suri, who is a young 14-year-old girl who sort of like lives wild and free within the woods surrounding that particular clan community. I forget the name of the, it's like doll or something. Suri is the mystic who is sort of connected with this community, even though she lives free. It's her responsibility to sort of like read the signs within the forest and the world and interpret or let the community know if something is amiss, which does happen at the start of this book. She comes to Persephone, who is in the moment of transition, shall we say, and tells her that the end of the world is coming. All of the humans are going to die, just like all of them, and okay, you got your message. Peace. It's actually really, really funny. Suri provides a lot of comic relief throughout the book, but I would say also a lot of the heart. She has a wolf animal companion named Mina, I believe, and Suri just was such a light within this story. I can't wait to see where her storyline goes as we progress into the rest of the series. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have a Frey main character named Arian, who is actually one of the Frey who does have magic. So through Arian's POV, we learn a lot more about the Frey society and their beliefs and traditions and culture and the inter-Frey political dynamics at play as well. The humans really only have interactions with some of the Frey, it turns out, and there are a broad spectrum of clans within the Frey, some of which who do not have magic, or the majority of which do not have magic, except for this single clan to which Arian belongs. So from this first book, and with the human perspectives that we're getting, as well as the events that have happened, and from Arian's perspective as well, we already get a sense of some of the potential conflicts that are going to be happening here with the event with this human killing a Frey, or the god killer as Wraith comes to be known. So the reactions to that, both from the Frey side as well as the human side, but then we can also, from Arian's perspective, get to see that there are also some division, there is some division within the Frey. Having watched other reviews, I thought it was really interesting that a lot of reviewers commented that this was a more plot-driven book, which is so interesting because I would have personally said that this was a character-driven book. But I think it's because the balance between the character moments, the character growth, and the plot progression of the book was just really evenly balanced, and I tend to be a character-driven reader, so I feel like I noticed those moments a lot more so, and so it felt more character-driven to me, because while definitely stuff happens in the course of this book, nothing too crazy happens just yet. So while I felt like this was a more character-driven book in that we were being introduced to some of the main players, their worlds, how they see the world, a little snapshot of the world from their perspectives, as well as the beginnings of the growth that I think will allow them to become the perhaps legends that they might become in future books. I also feel like the author did a really good job of introducing some potential conflicts and intrigue, some potential mysteries, and a shattering of beliefs and prejudices and biases for future books as well. While the focus here was on setting up the series, it didn't feel the need, or it didn't feel like the author felt the need to set up every single thing so that the book was exclusively world and character building. It felt like there was still enough going on within the plot, with some exciting reveals, some, as I said, like laying the foundations of like intrigue to make the readers very curious about how certain things will roll out in the future, so that you still feel satisfied from having read and completed that first book. Now to getting into the section of the review that is the who should read this book and who shouldn't. As I said previously, I do think this is a really great starter fantasy. So if you are just getting into the genre, if you are coming up from perhaps reading middle grade, or you want to try fantasy out, or you were a young adult fantasy reader, but you want to read something with like a little bit more grit, a little bit less angst, I think this is a very, very approachable fantasy series to read, or the first book, sorry. I also think that character-driven readers are really going to appreciate this book. I do anticipate that there is going to be a lot more plot, fast-paced movement in the future books, But I think this did a really great job of laying the foundations for character-driven readers to really get hooked and care about these particular characters, so that the rest of the series becomes that much more of an enjoyable experience for those character-driven readers. And I would recommend this book as well to people who are looking for something that feels a little bit more classical in its exploration of the distinctions between different species, their beliefs, their cultures, their biases, and all of that, which we have tended to think a little bit away from with more of our modern fantasy books recently. So if you want something that has a bit of a classical feel without having classical writing, this is a great book for that. And of course, if you like to binge read series, it is very helpful that all 6 books in this series are completed. Yes, that is a longer series, but they're all already out, and it's 6 and not 12. So that's great too. Now, who shouldn't read this book, I think, is a little bit tougher to say. I would, because again, it's the beginning of a series. So I would say if you don't like setup books, this is probably going to be a bit of a tough read for you. But again, I will, asterisk that by saying that I think it's going to get really, really juicy and really expansive from here. But this does have some of that slowness that some setup fantasies have, even though I personally think it was successful at getting you hooked in. Same goes for action-paced or fast-paced readers. This book was not that, I don't believe. But I feel like that's where we could be going, especially with the conflicts that were being, the foundations of the conflicts that were being laid in this book. And if you don't like those classical settings with humans and elves and goblins and giants, this is really, really that. Even though I do think it has a modern feel to the writing, a very simplistic feel, it is very, very classical in its arrangement. And on that note, I would say it is very simple, straightforward writing. So if you like something that is a little bit more meaty, a little bit more purple, a little bit more explorative and philosophical, I don't really think that is going to be provided by this series. This seems like a little bit more of a straightforward, here's the way that it is kind of approach to writing. So those are my thoughts on Age of Myth by Michael J. Sullivan. As I said, I thoroughly enjoyed this book. I cannot wait to see where the rest of the series takes me, and I hope to get to the second book as soon as possible. Let me know if you've read this book. Do you agree or disagree with what I've said so far? Or if I have perhaps convinced you to pick up this series. I will see you guys next time. Have a great day. Bye.